All right. Well, my name is Brandon Helwig, and I'm honored today to be joined by Grayson Grundhoefer. I hope I said that correctly. Grayson of SicEm365, and he pretty much does it all for SicEm365, which if UCF fans maybe don't know, it's the preeminent, the number one media source for all things Baylor athletics. They're affiliated with 365 Sports. I believe, does that air on a radio station in Waco? I know we all watch the broadcast live on YouTube, and I've been a guest on there multiple times, and we always like the clips that always they edit and stuff like that. Does that run on radio down in Waco?
It does, yeah, segments. It's usually like a best of type thing is what we have on there. But yeah, it's been awesome, man. They've done some great stuff. We've really been able to elevate that through realignment and also, adding these teams that are going to add a lot to the Big 12.
Yeah, obviously we're here to talk today about this Saturday's home game at UCF between the Baylor Bears and UCF Knights. As you know, it's the very first home game in Big 12 history for UCF, and the two schools, have a little bit of history, which we were just talking off air that all about. In 2013, Baylor was the champions of the Big 12, and UCF was the champions of the American Athletic Conference, and the two schools met in the Tostitos Fiesta Bowl, and that was one of those, Baylor was kind of in their prime, and a lot of people doubted UCF's chances to even be on the same field as Baylor. I remember watching ESPN had a bowl show. It's called Bowl Mania. And I don't know if you remember this at all, but I think Todd McShay was on there. There was a couple analysts, and they had something called confidence points, and how confident are you that one team is going to beat another? And they completely dismissed UCF's chances, and they gave all their confidence points to Baylor. And, when we got to the game, it was completely different than what people foresaw. It was UCF kind of took it to Baylor, not the other way around. UCF won 52-42. It kind of felt to me like it was the margin was even higher than that. But Grayson, we were just talking. What's your background with Baylor? And you were at that game, correct?
Yeah, I mean that's such an interesting time because I was a student, and so I was still a student in 2013. It was my sophomore year actually, and so it's funny because you see Baylor and they were ranked so high going into that game, but really they hadn't had a ton of top 10 success until that year, right? Like RG3's year, they were really good, but they won the Alamo Bowl. Like they weren't,
right.
They weren't competing, to be in a national championship. And then 2012, a lot of people forget they were really bad to start that year. And then they got hot late. They beat Kansas State by 20, and K-State or by 30 actually. And K-State was the number one team in the nation towards the end of the year. And that kind of led in to this magical 2013 with Bryce Petty and Antoine Goodley and Tevin Reese, and scoring all these points. You look at their first three games of the year, they were scoring 70 the first three against a bunch of nobodies, that they were playing early in the season. And during that year, it was really fascinating. They were really, really good, but they still had moments where it was they don't play defense. Can they run the ball when they absolutely have to run the ball when someone's challenging them? And can they stay on the field? And honestly, in that UCF game, all those warts really came out because at times they were unable to run the football. They couldn't get UCF off the field. And UCF was the more disciplined team as well, which was another issue that Baylor had that year. So I remember it vividly. I remember going to that game and everyone thought Baylor was going to win. I remember UCF fans that I met before the game were a little nervous about this, a little nervous about what's going to happen here. But they were very prepared and they were ready for everything they saw. And Blake Bortles played one heck of a game as well.
Yeah, that was the game that pretty much sealed the deal for him to go to the NFL draft. And, I don't know if anyone thought he was going to be selected number 3, but he was. But that game earned him a lot of money, honestly. But what do you kind of remember about Baylor's perception of UCF in that game? I remember the fan base kind of, I don't know, they felt it was kind of beneath them maybe to play a UCF. They were in I guess it was the last year of the Americans automatic bid. It was still called the BCS back then. It wasn't really the New Year's Six that season. But I just remember walking around. I had credentials, and I remember the student section, everyone made posters. They get on TV, and I remember there were some girls had a poster that said something like, "We wish we were playing Oregon" or something. It was kind of like, why do we got to play UCF? What do you kind of remember about that element?
I thought it was really interesting because Baylor hadn't had, this kind of success. So I guess my vantage point wasn't really that it didn't have anything to do with UCF. I think everyone thought they were like a good program and that they've earned their way to this BCS Bowl. I think it was more about what everyone thought of Baylor that year, to be honest with you. They had a real clunker against Oklahoma State that year, just got blown out of the building. Baylor fans remember it as, Bryce Petty tripping over an imaginary sprinkler head on the way to the end zone. He falls on what was going to be a for sure touchdown, and then everything unraveled after that. But I think that was more so what it was, like confidence in Baylor. But I think a lot of people respected UCF and felt like that's a good program. They had some magical moments during that season, if I remember correctly. The one-handed catch down the sideline.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of cool things I think people remember. I think that I really think it was more about Baylor than really, kind of sleeping on UCF, even though the media told you should. Like everyone thought Baylor was just going to crush them. Obviously did not happen.
Yeah. And I know you're going to be at the game this week, and they're going to honor the 2013 UCF team. There's a big reunion this weekend. I think the team's having a dinner on Friday night. They're going to be honored after the first quarter. George O'Leary, former head coach, is going to be, among the people in town. So it'll be kind of a neat weekend coinciding with UCF's first Big 12 game. But, let's talk about this year. Baylor, it was one of those teams, obviously a team that won the Big 12 2 years ago. I know last year was a little disappointing. Was at 6-6 regular season, lost the bowl game to finish with a losing record. And, you kind of looked at, you probably remember exactly what the preseason prediction of Baylor was, but it was a team that you looked at it and you look at their schedule. I believe Baylor has 8 home games. Is that right? 8 out of the 12 were at home.
They do, and they've already used 4 of them.
So you look at that setup and like, well, if this is, I know they had some tough games early. You got to play Utah and, you had Texas and, it was a Big 12 opener, but you kind of looked at that and said, this could be maybe a sleeper team, that could contend just because you have all those home games should be an advantage. I don't think anybody saw Texas State coming in the opener. UCF people are a little bit familiar, are very familiar with the head coach at Texas State. G.J. Kinney was an assistant here with Gus Malzahn a couple years ago before he went to Incarnate Word and then moved on to Texas State. But just kind of looking at the 1-3 start, I know there's been, obviously Utah and Texas are a tough competition, but what's been the most surprising thing to you about that?
I think, yes, obviously you mentioned Texas and Utah, very good teams. There's no doubt about it. Both of them are in the top 10 and very deserving. Utah hasn't even had their starting quarterback, who's very, very good in Cam Rising. But, I think the biggest thing for me when I look at this Baylor team is that last year they decided to not attack the transfer portal very hard, and they ended up going 6-6 last year. If you go back and look at their schedule and watch their games, they easily could have been a 9-3 team. It's Big 12 play, right? It's little things here and there that just cause you to slip up. Like the TCU game is the perfect example of that. There's no way TCU should have beaten Baylor last year the way that game went, but you found a way to lose. And so I think, going into this year, it kind of felt like they really needed to attack the transfer portal. And they did that. They kind of learned their lesson, right? That, hey, you know what? We need to adapt to this new way of college football, find guys who can fit the program and also really contribute and not just rely on the guys that are on the roster. The problem is they didn't quite attack it hard enough still. And when you look at Baylor and you look at where they've had their problems, you look at the offensive line, which has been a staple. They have an amazing offensive line coach who almost got hired by Georgia 2 years ago in Eric Mateos. But they're young and they're not playing up to par. And that has been a huge problem. It's completely, I would say, demolished any of their chances of having a very, very good offense in the early going because they have not ran the ball successfully enough. So that's been a big area. And then I think a lot of people would look at the secondary on defense. The secondary has not been good. They've been attacked and exploited. That's what happened in the Texas State game. And also, obviously, against Texas, they simply – for large stretches of that game, they should not. It didn't look like they were even should have been on the same field as Texas at times. And so those two areas have been the biggest problem: secondary, offensive line. And they honestly, you could point to it being corrected in the transfer portal, and they still have scholarship spots open. So you just kind of wonder, why didn't they? Why didn't they attack it more and really bring in some veterans to help solidify those two position groups?
Yeah, is the fact that starting quarterback Blake Shapen, and he played the entire Texas State game, right? And he had injured himself at some point, or did he finish the game?
Yeah, so he actually sprained his MCL on the very first drive of the game against Texas State. He threw a touchdown on that drive and sprained his MCL on that throw. It was an 8-point game when he got hurt. And truthfully, you go back and look at the drive logs, Baylor was moving up and down the field, even with him hobbling around.
Okay.
I mean, he was hurt. It's been a discussion point with Baylor fans, but I do think that there's reasons to say they might have been able to come back in that game. And I think you can definitely watch the Utah game and point to reasons that they probably would have won that game, potentially with Blake Shapen.
So what is his status? I remember, I think a couple weeks ago, everyone's putting a week timeline or, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is. And this was kind of the game where it seemed like could be the first opportunity for him to come back. I think John Rice Plumlee, UCF starting quarterback, he's kind of dealing with a similar situation right now, and it's kind of how fast the recovery is going to be. So do we know, is he questionable for Saturday? Do you have a gut feeling if he plays or not?
So it's a weird situation, right? Because I think John Rice Plumlee got hurt the very next week from Blake Shapen, and it kind of feels like John Rice Plumlee is maybe a week away or 2 weeks away, and it kind of feels like Blake Shapen is about at the point where he can play. And he warmed up last week. He had a big knee brace on, which he's never worn during his career at Baylor. But he did warm up last week. He was officially day to day by Dave Aranda. I kind of have a hunch that if he's even if he's truly back to where they feel like comfortable that he won't get hurt playing, I almost think they're going to just say let's do it, because honestly, if you start 1-4, it's just very hard to make a bowl from that standpoint. So I do think he's very close. If I had to bet on it, I'd probably say that he does play on Saturday.
Yeah. So, I mean, if he can't go, Sawyer Robinson has been the backup. How has he performed? Has it been a big drop off from where Shapen would have been?
So Sawyer came from Mississippi State, and Mississippi State runs an air raid offense, right? Or they did with Mike Leach.
Right, with Leach.
So he decided to transfer. And the thing of it is he was very talented. He was a 4-star quarterback out of the Lubbock area. Went to Mississippi State because he grew up loving Mike Leach, right? And that was like his guy. That's who he wanted to play for. Decided to transfer to Baylor, being a more pro-type offense. But it was always going to take him some time to get to the point where he was as comfortable in the offense as Blake Shapen. And I think that's kind of where you're seeing him try to transition, is that the playbook is much more limited with him at quarterback. So you see flashes here and there, but you also see just a guy who's not comfortable at the things that they ask him to do. And then also against Utah, he sprained his ankle in the third quarter. And from that point on, Baylor could not move the ball at all. And so he's more of a running threat, and he's bigger than Blake Shapen. But once he hurt his ankle, a lot of his game was taken away.
Yeah. So injury situation, I understand there maybe a few other guys maybe coming back. I know you said the secondary has been a concern. I heard maybe one of your safeties is returning. Are there some other players you expect to be closer to full health this weekend?
So Devin Lemire, who's probably their most experienced and best safety, he actually played last week, and he had a huge elbow brace on because he dislocated his elbow in the first game of the year in the middle of that game. And so he's back. He'll help. He's definitely helpful. And then they get one of their cornerbacks back, Tubin Williams, who hadn't played since the beginning of the year, which honestly hasn't been their biggest problem. It's mainly been safeties and linebackers that have been exploited, not so much cornerbacks. So a little bit of help there, but honestly, Brandon, the biggest area where they could get the most help is nose tackle. And early in the year, if you watch Baylor last year, they had Apu Ika, and they had him in 2021 as well. He was an LSU transfer, an awesome, just a great person, but also one of the best nose tackles in all of college football. They lost him this offseason. They went out and got Jarrell Boykins. He's about 330 pounds, and he's a big dude. He was a JUCO guy. He's a little bit older, a little more experienced. And they were supposed to have him, but he hurt his MCL in the green and gold game, Baylor spring game, and he hasn't played since. And so he's getting much closer. And then they have a redshirt freshman, Trey Emery, who's about 310, 315 pounds, who also got hurt in the spring. who hasn't played all year. So both of those guys have been out all season, and it's caused Baylor to have to play a 275-pound nose tackle in Cooper Lands, and then a Oregon transfer in Trevin Maya, who only played defensive end at Oregon. He's had to play nose tackle because of his size. So, I mean, it's hard to replace big guys like that, and Baylor simply has not been able to do that with the guys they have on the roster. So getting them back would be huge. I think Jarrell Boykins is probably closer than Trey Emery, and I would kind of expect him to play as well this weekend.
Obviously, quarterback at Blake Shapen does go. Just kind of tell us a little bit more about him. If he's healthy, what kind of threat is he throwing the ball and running the ball? You said he's not as much of a running threat as Sawyer Robinson, correct?
Yes. So Sawyer is more of a power, good athlete, like built. He's much bigger. He's like 20 pounds bigger than Blake Shapen. And so that's what he kind of brings to the table. But I think if you talk to Baylor fans, they're very split on Blake Shapen because last year was kind of ups and downs, right? He had turnovers at really bad times, and there were just things that did not go his way. But everyone forgets that was his first year as a starting quarterback. Like, it takes time for these guys. And if you go back and watch what he did for the 2021 team, I think people would change their minds on him a little bit. He won the Big 12 championship game. He threw 3 touchdowns in the first half against a really good Oklahoma State team. And then he separated his shoulder early in the third quarter. And then then it was just a defensive grinded out game for Baylor to end that one. But he's a really talented kid, and he's got a big arm. He can really, really sling it. And that's something that they don't have with Sawyer Robertson. He doesn't have the arm strength that Blake does. And I think the biggest thing with Blake that we heard all offseason was he took big steps forward as a leader. And I think we saw that in the first game. Despite him getting hurt, he just would not come off the field. He just was relentless, kept competing, kept making plays. He's a really good player, and a guy who I think Baylor fans underrate a little bit, and a guy who I think his best football is ahead of him. And because of that, he could be a huge difference in Baylor's success going forward.
When you look at the rest of the offense, I know you talked about struggles on the offensive line from a blocking standpoint. Who are some players to watch? Like, is there running back talent? I understand. I think Dominic Richardson had been injured. I think he returned last week. Just tell me about kind of the running backs and wide receivers, tight ends. Who are some of the names to watch at those positions?
So it's been really weird at running back, and not necessarily that I'm surprised by it, but it's just been a weird situation from a national perspective, I think, because Richard Reese was a preseason first-team All-Big 12 guy, and he's not playing that much. And a part of that is game script. A part of that is Baylor not being able to block for him, so them having to use a bigger power back like Dominic Richardson to try to just grind out yardage. So that's how I would separate the two. Richardson, bigger, more physical. Richard Reese, fast, explosive, good burst through the hole, but needs a hole. He doesn't really break tackles very well at the line of scrimmage. So those are their two running backs. Richardson, he tweaked his ankle a little bit against Texas, which is what he was dealing with the week before. But I expect him to play. I think he'll be fine. Outside of that, it's a freshman running back in Dawson Pendergrass, who had a really good game against Long Island. Good player, freshman. He's solid, but I think his best football is still ahead of him. I think Richardson and Reese are more the focal points. Now, as far as pass catchers, Ketron Jackson is definitely the guy to keep an eye on. He's the Arkansas transfer. I mean, he is very, very good. If Baylor had Blake Shapen, I think this would be a guy that more people would have their eyes on because he's made explosive plays every single game for the Bears. And he's a guy who I think people are going to be very surprised about once Baylor's at full strength on offense. Very, very good player. Outside of that, Drake Dabney at tight end, I think, is another guy to keep an eye on. He's been very, very successful. And it's just a guy who seems like he's always open. Big target, 6'5", 6'6". So I would say those two are probably their best pass catchers to go along with their running back core.
Yeah, and on the other side of the ball, defensively, who are some players to watch? There's some standout players on that side. I know you're getting Baylor's getting some guys back from injury, but who are some of the names that we're probably going to hear on Saturday on that side?
You know, I think the biggest thing that is working against Baylor really is I don't think people realize that their defensive line has actually been pretty good for the most part. They've been put in very uncomfortable situations with, whether it's against Texas where they're spreading you out, throwing the ball all over the place, same with Texas State, or against Utah where by the end of the game they were on the field for so long and just finally they wore down. But I think up front, guys like Gabe Hall, and TJ Franklin are two veteran elder statesmen who I do think are going to be a problem for a lot of teams in the Big 12, especially once they get a nose tackle and those two guys are able to focus more on rushing the passer and getting into the backfield as opposed to trying to just stop the run. I think that'll help them significantly. Outside of that, you got Garmin Randolph and Byron Vaughns, who play kind of a jack position, outside linebacker. You'll see them rushing after the quarterback, trying to create some havoc. Outside of that, they got two veteran linebackers who are solid in Matt Jones and Mike Smith, but I would say most people would say they've kind of underwhelmed. Been okay, shown some flashes, but haven't really lived up to, I think, what many people thought going into the season. And then outside of that, their cornerbacks have played really, really well. They start four of them really, like as far as rotating them, and two of them are true freshmen. So they've really done a nice job rotating four of them in and playing really, really well on the outside. It's more the interior through the pass game, the slot receivers that have really killed them in the early going.
Now, UCF is a heavy favorite. I mean, we were kind of talking about underdogs and favorites in the Fiesta Bowl 10 years ago, and UCF opened up as a double-digit favorite. I think they still are, 11.5-point favorite. Did that surprise you at Vegas kind of, believing that UCF is – I know it's a home game, so you're going to have that advantage, but did that line surprise you?
I think with the uncertainty of Blake Shapen, I don't think the line surprised me. I truly think if they don't have Blake Shapen in this game, I can definitely understand why the line would be like that. Because, if you look at how Baylor's done, like they played really well against Utah, but I think Baylor does a much better job against teams that play more that play style that Utah does, where it's more pro style. They're going to try to run at you, physicality, tight ends, everything like that. Where Baylor struggled is against teams that are going to spread you out. And I mean, UCF is going to spread them out and take shots deep downfield and try to exploit the secondary. So I definitely understand it. I think Vegas is kind of thinking that Baylor's going to have a tough time scoring more than like 24 points in this game. And then therefore thinking UCF can easily score in the 30s. So I understand it. I do think if Blake Shapen plays, though, I would definitely think that this game's going to be a lot closer than that.
Yeah. So in your estimation, if Baylor's going to be successful on Saturday, what needs to happen?
They have to run the football. And I think you saw what happened to UCF last week against Kansas State. And, to a certain extent, UCF versus Boise State. Like those two teams were able to run the football.
Yes, they were.
Against UCF. And to me, those are the two games that either UCF lost or was a very close game. Like that Boise State game was an awesome game, very close. Two teams that really played very hard throughout. But the common denominator is if you can run on UCF, you can keep their offense on the sideline and you can have opportunities to wear them down, focus on time possession, and really just grind out a win. And Baylor's going to have to do that. Now, the funny part is Baylor hasn't been able to run the ball, and UCF has had problems stopping the run. So it's like something's got to give right in this game.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about head coach Dave Aranda. A few years ago, UCF played LSU in the Fiesta Bowl following the 2018 season. So, going through the media day stuff out there in Arizona, had the opportunity to kind of listen in on Coach Aranda, and he's a very cerebral coach, kind of mild-mannered, kind of philosophical. He's a very unique personality in college football. I can't remember any coach that's like him. Obviously, you talked a little while ago about, 2 years ago winning the Big 12 and what a great accomplishment that was. I know 2020 is one of those years that I don't, whatever the record was, I know it's doesn't even count. But 2021 was a great year for Baylor. Last year, I know you mentioned a lot of those games could have gone either way, but it ended up being 6-6 regular season, and this year's, slow start as well. So what's kind of the fan base view right now of Dave Aranda?
Yeah, the fan base is not happy at all. I think a lot of it is compounded by the fact that they started 6-3 last year and had an opportunity. If they would have won out, they would have been in the Big 12 championship game. But they got smashed by Kansas State at McLean Stadium, lost a close one to TCU, lost to Texas in the fourth quarter, a really bad fourth quarter. And then they showed up for the bowl game, and Air Force, crushed them. Air Force played a really good game, and Baylor was clearly not ready for that game. And then you fast forward to this year, and they continue losing. And so the fan base, I think, is just feeling like the program's trending in the wrong direction, which is understandable. I can understand why people would think that. I do think that they've had some bad luck this year as far as the 3 FBS teams they've played are 11-1. They had to play that schedule without their starting quarterback, and that's hard. Like, that's hard for any program, especially a program that's not, a top 10 team in the nation with a backup that is, a 5-star guy, so it's tough. And so I understand the criticism. And I do think that Baylor fans right now, if you ask half of them, they would probably say, we'd love to replace Dave Aranda right now. I think that that's the general thought, but I think that it's also really important to just kind of take a step back and realize that if you go look at kind of how Baylor got to this point, it's really built on 2 really bad recruiting classes. In 2019, which was Matt Rule's final year at Baylor, where he was leaving. They didn't finish the class strong because he left. Jahdae Barron, who's one of the best safeties in all of college football at Texas, he was signed with Baylor. Dave Aranda let him out of his NLI when Matt Rule left. So you're missing a guy there who'd be a key contributor. But it just, in general, that class didn't finish strong. And then 2020 was Dave Aranda's first class, and he didn't have a lot of time to form that class because he was hired. And so you put all that together and you look at the roster and you go, wow, that's why there's not a lot of veterans who are playing big roles on this team. And that's where I think the problem has been. Those 2 recruiting classes right there building up this program, it hasn't worked out. And so the hope is that the other classes, 2021, 2022, and 2023, will kind of be building points. But obviously, fans aren't patient. And so you're kind of seeing just kind of what happens when you miss on a recruiting class or 2, especially 2 in a row.
How do fans view his personality? Because, I think I was watching the Texas State game on ESPN Plus, and, game's not going great. And every time they show him on the sideline, he kind of has that same look on his face, kind of emotionless, kind of like not angry, not yelling, not getting after guys, just kind of standing there. So I'm just kind of curious from that perspective. Is that something that maybe grinds on fans a little bit? Because, I would kind of think it might.
I don't think anyone cared when he won the Big 12 championship in 2021. Right. It was more like, wow, like he's a cerebral mind and who cares? Like, who cares about his demeanor? He clearly can coach football. I think that's the thing that people forget is, like, he won a Big 12 championship. Not many teams in the current Big 12 have actually won a Big 12 championship. And so it's a big deal that they were able to do that, especially while Oklahoma was still really good.
Right.
And Oklahoma dominated the conference for so long, and they still were able to win that one in 2021. So I would say that I think right now, when Baylor's struggling, there's a lot of people pointing to the fact that, oh, what if he was more energetic, or what if he did this and that, or had more of a charisma on the sideline. I do think there's some of that for sure. And I think it does grind some gears when it's like, man, why is he not emotional when they're 1-3? I can understand that, but I also think that's just not who he is. That's not how he's built. That's not how he's wired. And so the hope is he builds a staff around him that does fit that more. And I think he has to a certain extent.
What do you think is the Baylor perception of UCF coming into this weekend? I take it you've been at the press conference this week. What is Coach Aranda saying? What are some of the players saying? Like, what are they expecting when they get to Orlando this weekend?
I think the biggest thing for Aranda specifically was he talked about Gus Malzahn and just like how much respect he has for him and just the coach that he is, the style that he plays with, and the person that he is. And so I think all of that, Dave Aranda definitely mentioned. Baylor fans, I think they picture UCF, honestly, as a program that's kind of on the rise, a program that's like, man, we go into this new Big 12, and, this was before, Utah and the Pac-12 schools decided to come in. But of the new schools, I think pretty much everyone that's a Baylor fan feels like UCF is probably in the best position to really capitalize on it and just be kind of one of those wild card teams as we move forward into the future. These other Pac-12 teams, Utah and stuff like that, are probably, adding a little bit of competition in that department. But I do think in general, Baylor fans are pretty worried about what UCF's going to be going forward. And I know, personal opinion, UCF's in a great location. They have a great opportunity to capitalize on this Big 12 momentum and the fact that they're playing well early in the season. So I know recruiting's been great for them as well, as I cover that extensively. And so I think they're a really good program and one that I think a lot of Baylor fans have respect for.
Yeah, just kind of expanding on that. That's what's kind of the Baylor view on, the new Big 12 going forward. Obviously the 4 additions from the Pac-12. It's going to be a completely different conference by next year. Obviously Texas and Oklahoma are moving on, but just kind of how does Baylor kind of view all the changes? Because, the Big 12 has obviously seen a lot of changes over the last dozen or so years.
I think like quite a few programs in the Big 12. I don't want to speak for UCF or speak for all the other programs, but I do feel like there's this commonality between the fan bases that they feel like their team is going to be the team that runs the Big 12, right? That they're going to be the team that's going to come in and just be, the Oklahoma or be, a program that always consistently wins. And I think the reality of the situation is I think every Baylor fan feels like this conference is going to be so competitive and just like every week you're going to have a battle. Every week you're going to have a program that pretty much recruits at the same level you do, outside of a couple outliers. But for the most part, like you're playing with very similar talent, and a lot of it's going to come down to X's and O's, luck, and just, recruiting the right guys, to be honest with you. And I think that's kind of what everyone's looking forward to. Also, Baylor fans in general are kind of tired of Texas at this point, just kind of what they've brought to the table in recent years, and then the move to the SEC. So I think they're ready to just kind of move on from that, much like many of the schools from the old Big 12.
I know for someone in Florida or someone that maybe outside of the Baylor community, the first thing we always think about Baylor, we think about the Art Briles era, whether it's the teams and how great those teams were, or the controversy. Now that we're a few years removed from all the fallout, I don't know if there is an average Baylor fan response, but how does the average Baylor fan kind of view today Art Briles in that era? I'm sure if you guys 10 different fans, you get 10 different answers, but what's kind of the perspective now of Art Briles in that era in Baylor history?
Yeah, I think a lot of Baylor fans would consider, obviously, if you're not taking into account what happened off the field, I think most Baylor fans who are, level-headed would tell you, obviously, like it needed to be a change, something needed to happen, he needed to move on, everything like that makes perfect sense and is how it should be. But I also think it's hard for a lot of Baylor fans because Baylor was not good for a really long time, and then Art Briles comes in and it's like, man, we're close to being at a point where Baylor could be, recruiting at a top 20 level every single year, capitalizing on Oklahoma and Texas not being at the level that they were for a while. And it really felt like Baylor was about to start separating itself from even those two schools. And so I do think there's some of that, right? Kind of hindsight looking back on what could have been. I also think that always, unfortunately, is going to impact expectations for whoever the coach is at Baylor. And it's a big part of the reason that I think Dave Aranda is getting the kind of heat that he is from the fan base, because there's just this expectation that Baylor should be winning at the highest level every single year. And in reality, college football's changed so much since Art Briles was there. And there's a lot of things that have changed about it that make things a little bit more difficult for everyone, including smaller schools like Baylor and even schools that aren't a blue blood. And so I think there's a little bit of that, and it's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate time period, I think, for all Baylor fans, just for what happened at Baylor and what happened under his leadership, but also, kind of just losing what happened on the field as well, which is obviously very tough.
Also about Art Briles, we had a question on our message board. I'd made a post a little earlier asking if fans had any particular Baylor questions. Someone asked, did you ever see Art Briles wear short sleeves? Like what is the story with him only wearing long sleeve shirts? Is that something that Baylor people talked about back in the day, or what is the reason for that?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know the specific reason, but he always had a long sleeve shirt on. Okay. Always. And he liked it. And it's funny because I feel like some Baylor coaches have had this same thing. Like, I don't know if you remember, Matt Rule always wore like this I don't even know what you would call it.
Shacket?
Yeah.
Is it the shacket? That's kind of the name we call those things. It's like a jacket, a short sleeve jacket, a shacket.
Yes.
Because Josh Heupel at UCF always wore those. It seemed like the chubby guys, coaches always seem to wear those.
Right. So Matt always wore that. And then you got, Art Briles wearing the long sleeve every single time you saw him. Really weird. I don't know the full story behind it. I will also say, at that time I was a student, so I didn't cover Baylor at that time. But yeah, I know that he wore it every time though.
Yeah, NIL is obviously such a big component of recruiting these days. No one's ever completely candid about what kind of, war chest or whatever they want to call it, collectives that they have to go recruit with. What's the NIL scene like in Waco with Baylor? Is there a good collective setup? Do you feel it's competitive with the upper tier of the Big 12?
I don't know a ton about as far as like UCF compared to Baylor or
Right.
Kansas State compared to
Yeah,
Baylor.
we're all kind of learning. That's why I'm asking. We're all kind
Right.
of learning about each other because we're going to be recruiting against each other. But you think it's a pretty good setup you guys have at Baylor?
Yeah. So what I was going to say as well is like, I do know how they compare to the Texas schools though. And
Okay.
it's pretty much from what I understand, TCU seems like they have the biggest leg up on everyone as far as the NIL goes. And I think that's been pretty evident. They've recruited pretty well, and their transfer recruiting was very interesting this
Yeah.
year. Lots of former 5-star guys. But for Baylor, to be as competitive as Texas Tech and being close enough to TCU is really the biggest thing. And I do feel like, if they're close with those schools in Texas, and I think Houston's on the lower end of that as well, just
Right.
adding them in too. But for them to be right there, I would imagine that they're probably pretty close with the other top schools in the Big 12. That would be my guess, at least. I would consider them to probably be top half, potentially upper tier, but I do think that's probably reserved for maybe only like 3 schools. I would bet TCU is probably in that upper tier.
Right. Right. So who do Baylor fans consider their top rivals? Is there one top rival? Is there 1A, 1B? Obviously, all those Texas schools together, everyone's kind of a rival to a degree. Who would you say are the top rivals for Baylor?
So I think old Baylor fans would say that it's Texas. I think that was kind of the rivalry that they grew up with and saw. For me, it's without a doubt it's TCU, and I think
Okay.
that's where it's split. I think older fans would say Texas, newer fans would say TCU because they have had so many battles since 2013. When Gary Patterson was there, the drama between him and Art Briles, there was a lot of contention there. And just the fact that they both were really, really good as well made that a lot of fun. We were kind of robbed of seeing those two teams play in Big 12 championship games because they would have been a lot of fun, especially in 2014 when there was that whole college football playoff where I believe Baylor was 5th and TCU was 6th. That would have been a lot of fun to see. So I would say TCU, Texas is kind of there. And then Texas Tech is, I think, the other one that you could probably, some fans would say, especially because they hired Joey McGuire, who was at Baylor previously. And then he went to Texas Tech, and there was a little bit of,
Yeah.
bad blood. People were trying to make storylines about it. Ultimately, Joey's a really good guy, but it just was an interesting time, him leaving in the middle of the championship season to go take the head coaching job at Tech. And then obviously he comes back and plays Baylor at the end of the year, and he's not the head coach, but that he had involvement in helping them game plan. So I would kind of consider them the fringe team, but I think TCU and Texas are the two
Okay.
bigs.
Okay, so Baylor opened a new stadium, in 2014, McLean Stadium, and I've seen videos and pictures. It looks beautiful. We'll see. We don't know what the schedule is like for next year. Maybe UCF, goes to Baylor. We don't know that yet. Just kind of sum up what has McLean Stadium meant to Baylor and kind of tell us a little bit about the game day atmosphere there.
Yeah, I mean, it's meant everything, I would say, to a certain extent. I mean, the old stadium, Floyd Casey, great place. Like one of those places that's just, I mean, it was so grungy and just kind of run down, and you knew what you were getting when you went there. A lot of fun, but just a stadium that needed an upgrade. It was kind of off campus too. It was like 5 to 10 minutes off campus, so you had to drive to get there. McLean Stadium is right across the river. Students can walk right across it. You can sailgate. It's just a great game day atmosphere. And honestly, Baylor's had some great environments for games as well there. There have been some really fun moments. The 2014 game against TCU, 61-58 is kind of the one that comes to mind the most. But yeah, it's been really cool. It's very loud. It only seats about, maximum is like 50,000, complete maximum. And so, it's small, but it's perfect for Baylor. Baylor doesn't need a massive stadium. They don't have that many fans. We don't have a ton of, alumni because the enrollment's not huge. But I think it fits the program perfectly.
Yeah, we're just learning about these Big 12 venues and atmospheres. I was at Kansas State, and I love that atmosphere. I thought it was fantastic. That I went to the game in 2010, and it just looked completely different with the facilities. And I know Kansas State people like to think maybe they have the best atmosphere in this new Big 12. How would you kind of rank the atmospheres? Where does Baylor rank? Are they at the top for you? Or maybe you're a little biased, but what are some of the best atmospheres that we're going to be seeing here?
I mean, I don't know if UCF plays at Oklahoma State this year, and honestly, I don't know if Oklahoma State's going to be really good by the end of the year.
They do play them, but it's a home game for UCF.
Home game. Okay, so that place is special.
I know you're right. They're right on the stands. There's no room. They're right on the field. I've seen it on TV.
And they have the paddles, and the paddles are crazy, and they're right, like you said, you're right on the field. It's honestly dangerous. I don't understand how they still have this. Guys going full speed. If you get shoved, you're running straight into the wall. That place, it feels like they're right on top of you. And I think that environment when they're good, which they have been, typically this year, not so much, but that place when Gundy has them rocking, I don't think there's another one in the Big 12 that feels just so intimidating. And also it feels like they just get results every time that they play there. Obviously, Oklahoma and Texas have good environments, but that's more so because they have a lot of fans there. Oklahoma State's, I think, is really special. I've heard great things about K-State. I have not been to a game to K-State, but I've heard good things about it. I would bet that Baylor's is pretty close. And then Amon G. Carter is pretty good too, which is TCU Stadium. And they made renovation, so I'm sure it's probably even better than when I was there in 2019.
Yeah, our fans on the message boards, are they talking about coming down to Orlando for this game? Does Baylor traditionally travel well? I know this is, you got to get on a plane. It's not like you can drive across the state of Texas, but are you expecting a good Baylor contingent in Orlando on Saturday?
I think that it's probably going to be a little bit more sparse than it normally would be, and mainly because the tickets, honestly, for this game are a lot more expensive because it's UCF's first Big 12 game. So, you go look at UCF's future games and the tickets aren't very expensive, but you look at this one, it's no, you actually got to pay some money to have a good seat in the house because I think the demand is there. So I would bet that for this one, you're probably going to be very disappointed in the Baylor turnout. But I think in general, they travel, Baylor fans travel okay. I wouldn't say it's great, but it's okay.
Yeah, last thing, just kind of looking at the game, I don't know if you have a score prediction. I kind of hate being asked that sometimes because sometimes I just, make it up out of thin air. But do you have a general thought of how you think the game is going to go? Maybe a score range? Have you kind of thought that far ahead yet?
I have. And it's really tough because I think there are two score results here based on if Blake Shapen plays or not. I think it's the reality of the situation. And obviously, if John Rice Plumlee plays, that changes things too. I kind of don't think that he will. I don't know if you have any more.
Yeah, I think he's definitely out this week.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at as well. And so if he's not playing, Timmy McClain is there and he's played well. He kind of has an interesting link to Baylor because he lost the job to Gary Bohannon at USF and then transferred to UCF. And I think his future is pretty bright. But I think in this game, I honestly think if Blake Shapen plays, he's going to add just this calming presence to this Baylor offense. I just think they flow and function so much better with him. I think if he plays, I think Baylor actually does win this game. And I think it's going to be something like 34-31. Really good game, really competitive. You'll see points. I think both teams are going to score. But I think Baylor will be able to run the football and actually take shots deep downfield because Shapen does have that kind of arm talent. Now, if he does not play or if he's limping around the field, obviously that's a whole nother conversation. But if he doesn't play, then I think UCF's probably going to beat Baylor. If he doesn't play, I think it's probably going to be a score of something like 34 for UCF to probably 21 for Baylor would kind of be my expectation in that situation. So, pretty big swing. I think Blake Shapen in this game is probably worth something like 14 to 17 points.
Yeah, I'm kind of debating in my head how I think this game is going to go. And it's just such a big question mark because I have no doubt that UCF can move up and down the field and score points. It's just with that defense. I know K-State has a great offense coming back and how they were able to methodically run the ball down the field. UCF's run defense pretty much couldn't stop them. I just kind of want to see how they fare against maybe more middle of the pack, Big 12 team in Baylor. So I'm anxiously waiting to see how that fares this week. But Grayson, I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed learning a lot about Baylor. There's a lot of things I didn't know that you educated us on. So I really appreciate you coming on the show with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Brandon. Anytime, man. This was great. I'm really excited for this week, and I think it's going to be a really cool environment as well. And you might change my mind. Maybe UCF, the bounce house, is going to have a better environment than even Oklahoma State. So I'm really excited to be there and be in the house for that. It's going to be a lot of fun.
So what are your plans for this Saturday? You're just coming down. Are you going to be in the stands?
Yeah,
be tailgating at all, or?
I'm coming with my wife. We're going to come down. We'll probably go to Disney on Friday, and then we'll just be tailgating and hanging out at UCF. We might go to a Baylor. I know there's a Baylor tailgate down there, but if you got something in mind and you want to let me know about it, we might be able to show up.
Well, that's one of those things that, the fan base is, for the fans that went to Kansas State, just everyone was like, oh man, everyone was so nice. They were so welcoming. It's a mature fan base. UCF kind of has the opposite reputation just because the average alumni age skews a lot younger, and you get a ton of students. There are, UCF has more students than anyone in the conference. And so when you're dealing with that and people who drink a lot before the game, there's some areas to avoid. I'm not saying anything's bad going to happen, but there's an area called Memory Mall, which is a big grassy lawn area. It's across the street from the arena, and that's where a lot of the students tailgate. And so a lot of times opposing teams' fans will park behind there on the other side of campus where it's free, and they'll walk through Memory Mall, and they may get kind of jeered at. I mean, hopefully everything's still respectful, but that's one thing UCF fans have been talking about this week. We're in the Big 12 now. Everyone needs to be respectful and be a fan base more like Kansas State. So I hope you have a good experience on Saturday. Well, like I said,
I'll give you an update. I'll give you an update on how it goes.
We'll chat next week on how things go for you. But I appreciate it, Grayson. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Brandon. Appreciate you.
Take care.